Hey, I'm Brooke. I'm the founder of Cobalt, and we're building a simulation and evaluation platform for voice and chat agents. And I'm here with Marc, who's the CEO of Langfuse. Marc, can you tell us more about Langfuse?
Yeah, with Langfuse, we're building the open source LLM engineering platform, traditionally with a focus on more like LLM observability to really understand what happens step by step in the application, and then really focus a lot on evaluation and prompt management to help teams accelerate the LLM application workflow.
We're excited to chat today because we've seen a lot of people using Langfuse and Cobalt together, and are always curious to hear what are the advantages of using both together? When should I be using one or the other? And looking into some of these existing tooling around LLM infrastructure versus using these new platforms for testing voice applications. So we'd love to hear from your side, Marc, where you're seeing the differences at a high level and kind of what you're seeing in the voice space on your side.
Yeah, thanks, Brooke, for having me. Generally, with Langfuse, we focused on all sorts of LLM applications. So many async workflows, many chat applications, some voice applications. So it's just like the full bag of different application types. I'm super excited about the collab with you guys to go deep on the voice angle of it. And generally, Langfuse has, we have tried to solve with Langfuse mostly this kind of observability problem of my application is a bit more complicated. Before I return to the user, I'm doing 10 different LLM calls, retrieval steps, tool calls, really to understand where I spent my money, latency, and kind of where issues arise in a single completion. And rolling this up to a conversation level or even simulating it in development is really, really interesting for the voice-based applications.
How have you seen this change over the past 6 months? You guys have been very early to the LLM space. Where did a lot of your use cases start? And then where have you seen them trending?
We started in early 2023 with a couple of early customers. And from them, I think a couple of large use cases emerged next to voice, real-time, conversational applications. I think there's just one segment within the conversational applications, which in fact, they are not the largest in terms of volume on our platform because batched background workflows are just way larger. But they are the ones where large companies actually bring things into production because they're they're interested in automating customer facing workflows. So this is really exciting. And they are always cost cutting or revenue generating. So it's really cool. But then next to it, there are a lot of background tasks that are happening where it's not necessarily a conversation or anything, but it's more if you want to classify something or route a ticket to the right person, there's not necessarily a conversation, but conversational applications have really been really interesting. And they have some interesting challenges that make me excited about the collab.
Yeah, definitely. I think this is something that we've seen a lot from users is as the AI stack is evolving, one of the big questions engineers are asking when they start out is, what tools do I even need to be using in order to develop this? Especially, I think earlier on in voice, the question around should I be using these existing LLM evaluation tools are how do I simulate all of these different conversations? How do I build out this stack has been a big question. What do you see a lot of your users doing today with Langfuse when it comes to voice? And where do you think the challenges are around doing that with existing LLM infrastructure?
Yeah, I think the core piece of this whole thing is on the one side, tracing the individual execution of what's really happening step by step. And then second, having some infrastructure in place to actually run evaluations on a message and basically conversation level, where I would probably draw the grid of, we have an online use case of applications running with actual users, and we want to know whether things are working or not and where they are failing. And this can be done on a conversation level or on a single task level. Then we have this whole offline problem of we actually want to benchmark the application on some test cases, which we can do on a conversation level again, where the question is how do we do conversational level testing of an agent or of an application? And second, we could also just do the next message evaluation. And overall, within Langfuse, I think many users have been successful in all of the grid except for I want to test a whole agent and I want to simulate basically the application and user. Because many have basically asked for it and then ended up creating these kinds of frameworks themselves where they try to simulate. And then, but then the question is, does my test case actually measure what it wants to measure? Or am I just measuring how bad my simulation actually is? And in production, it's way simpler where usually a single message evaluation is really meaningful because you can classify did my application ask for a next follow-up question? And then I can apply an eval of, was this the best next follow-up question? These kind of workflows are really simple to build on a single message level, where often building them on a conversational level even doesn't make that much sense if the conversation is long running. But in testing, going for the conversational level is interesting just because many teams start with an integration level test, which is simple to create because they don't want to get into creating unit level tests while a lot of the application is still moving and they are early. I think simulations are interesting for early stage teams or teams who want to know whether things are working while making a lot of changes. Whereas then probably when moving, like being more mature, then often they switch to or add more unit level tests because they're like more predictable and like simpler and faster to run because you can parallelize them.
Totally. I think that's definitely something we've seen with our customers is like early on in these integration tests, or even just starting with monitoring, we see a lot of teams like just starting with online evals and then moving to, okay, now we have something that's working. Now we're building out the simulations and the offline evals, but it's still at a very high level of we're just testing the agent end to end with a phone number or with, just the end to end endpoints. And then I think as voice agents have developed over the last 6 months, we're seeing now people are starting to think about, okay, how do I actually write more like unit tests that are testing these individual components? And then also how do I actually see what's happening behind the scenes with these voice agents? Because I think there's so many, even more so, I think, than existing LLM stacks, is that not only do you have all the complexities of LLM stacks of like RAG, and you have different, maybe more like traditional infrastructure, and then you have LLM calls and often like chains of LLM calls. But then on top of that, you have all of the problems of voice, which is notoriously difficult around audio metrics, interruptions, audio quality, all of these, like, are we ingesting the audio? Are we transcribing it? Are we then producing the right text to speech, etc. So we've seen the demand for being able to have that like deeper observability as a huge problem that a lot of people are facing now, which I think is where we've seen almost all of our customers adopting Langfuse because it's, open source, super easy to use, but then also gives you all of this like lower level traceability of what's happening in the conversation.
Yeah, I think early on, we kind of acknowledged that there are like so many different use cases of applications where usually it's interesting to either like partner, for example, with Coval for a specific use case, because being opinionated for the use case really matters too. And you have way more bandwidth to just focus on voice, which is a huge segment. So there are like lots of big problems. And second, also that all of the data is available via the Python SDK as well, where then many teams just use our SDK to fetch, like, let's give me the last 1,000 conversations my agent had in prod. And maybe I can just run it through like a simple like clustering algo because I want to know like what's happening here, or which kinds of users ask which kinds of questions. I mean, there's always room to build something opinionated, but we start definitely by having the interfaces where people can just explore by themselves in a notebook.
Yeah, definitely. What are some of the things that you've seen voice agent companies doing in terms of tracing that might be different than a traditional LLM stack, and how should people be thinking about tracing for voice applications? Is it very similar, or are there other considerations?
I think there's like the today and what could be built to make it even better for voice. I think today most problems are solved by having traces as in the sense of other LLM observability platforms, meaning it's really about the step-by-step what's happening within the application. And you can make this more usable for a voice application by always including the transcription to be able to read it, but also the audio file as an attachment for the input and output. I think how a voice app could be better traced is if on a session or conversational level, basically this back and forth interruptions, how voice streams are actually happening. When this is modeled more nicely, we're currently looking into how to expand functionality in this way as well. Because with like real-time LLM APIs, the question is, if I get basically the stream in, how do I actually trace this nicely? Because I will probably end up first feeding this to a small model, then realizing, I want to change something, then replay the stream that already has happened to another model. So we are currently investigating how to basically improve tracing just for streamed models. But I think this is basically independent from the voice use case. Just voice makes it really easy for users to stream input, which usually doesn't happen that much.
Yeah, definitely. And it's nice that you can then reuse, I think, a lot of the learnings, because a lot of people building in voice right now have built out a lot of applications so that you can those learnings will transfer over. How would you think, a question we get a lot is, how do we think about what types of things should you test at an offline level, more on a high-level conversation versus unit testing, and then what should you test online at a high level versus more of a lower level tracing ability.
Interesting. My learnings are always from like the probably hundreds of teams that we work with in this segment of basically real-time chatty applications. And I've seen many people use the single turn evaluation strategies, especially when they want to comply with like a clear standard operating procedure or compliance procedure, or somehow like when there should be, when there's like a clear next step that's the best step, and when they want to evaluate whether the follow-up questions make sense. So for example, if you do like inbound calls for lawyers, then probably what you want to ask the people step by step is probably very standardized, and you can write tests for it, whether the next question made sense or whether it just took the conversation off rails. Where it's more difficult is, I don't know, if I do my personal therapy assistant, I like doing a best next question. I mean, it varies, and there's no clear opinion on whether the next best sentence is really good or bad, but it's more about how the conversation flows and whether there's like an arc to it or some kind of agenda where the application then pushes for different story points across the whole 60-minute session or something, where we've seen teams struggle to come up with like single turn evals in prod and in development. So I think it depends whether the interaction is very transactional, then probably writing single message tests is way more effective, as it's simpler, more accurate, you can parallelize it, it's cheaper. But if it's a more complicated application, like it will be really, really difficult to write these and then maintain these if functionality should change, like how to even adapt these unit tests. If you then sit on tens of thousands of these unit tests to cover every basically step within the 60-minute session, plus the 50 different personas for which you create the application, where you then have like, I don't know, tens of thousands of different test cases you first need to write, maintain, change, label. That's really difficult. But if I'm writing like a transactional app, then probably turn-based or step-based evals can work as well, where then probably aiming for session level just makes it easier. So time to value on evals goes up if the session level eval is good enough.
Yeah, definitely. I think these cases where you're trying to see a multi-step evaluation, if you try and do this with unit testing, will just explode. Versus, I think another case that we've seen work really well with unit testing is around, for example, testing a scheduler. So saying, when I schedule this appointment for January 3rd, does it then respond back with the right function call? Does it actually call the right function just for this exact case? Then that way, when your conversation fails at large, so that this example of, that it can schedule once. So then you can start to see, for example, we've seen where like a prompt upstream can actually affect a lot of downstream actions. And so then you can start to see, okay, I know all these components work, so something must be interacting between them, and then debug from there.
Yeah, I think when teams get started with more session level or simulation tests, I mean, these are good starting points to then also create more unit tests. If you see good examples happening within your test suite, you can then just promote them to the unit level test data set. I think it's not like either or, it's more like, where do you start? And for some teams, it's probably just easy if they know what they expect for like a couple of questions to just do unit tests. But for probably a majority in the voice-based simulation is simpler to get started with and gets you a lot of the results with less effort. And I like how, I think you showed me a demo where you just call the application. So, I mean, you don't even need to like set up the whole test infrastructure, but you just run on staging and it just works, which is like a really cool like developer experience, where you usually have some kind of like investment you need to put in to like run this in CI, or like it's more difficult to do unit tests by just calling a voice application.
Yeah, totally. You can just get up and running really quickly. And there, I think sometimes it's easy to get caught up in we're reinventing a lot of this infrastructure. Like there's a new paradigm of software engineering. And sometimes a lot of the things from traditional infrastructure just hold true around you should have unit tests, you should have integration tests. And there's this pyramid of tests that you should have. And so a lot of the testing strategy is a bit more of an art than a science. Designing your evaluation strategy to evolve as your organization also evolves. What testing you need as you mature changes over time.
Yeah,
well,
interestingly, we've seen many teams when they talk about this or scale this out. Like a feature we for a long time dragged on building was more like manually labeling data in the UI, where then many teams like integrate Langfuse with like Label Box or Label Studio to actually make this work, but then invested significant time into syncing between the different tools. And now we had more like an annotation product within the UI. And this has been really popular among teams who want to feel confident about their evals, to basically task domain experts to actually label the data. And I think for conversational applications, usually there's like one person who would otherwise take the call, who really knows whether this is like a good flow. And yeah, we invested quite some time into this functionality, because then you can benchmark whether the evals actually work and build trust in them before scaling them out, making changes, and just looking at evals before merging to prod. So yeah, that's been like an interesting insight. Initially, like when you ask someone, they never want labeling. They always want like evals that just work, but then they never trust the evals. So labeling just helps to build confidence.
Yeah, that's something we've seen as well, is like how do you label and then use that to inform how well your metrics are correlating with human judgment is really interesting. I think it's really cool seeing how Langfuse is solving a lot of these problems kind of like from the ground up, and then Coval is kind of solving them from top down. So I think super excited about the partnership of being able to integrate Coval and Langfuse really seamlessly, because I think that will just be huge for both of our users.
Yeah, I'm super excited about it.
Awesome. Well, it was great to chat about tracing, observability, all things evaluation. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Thanks, Brooke.
All right, see you, Mark.